everybody. Welcome to Crystal Lake Publishing's Author's Journey Poetry! And we have as our instructors, Colleen Anderson, Maxwell Igold, Jamal Hodge, and myself. And this is week 1, Introduction to Poetry. It is a pre-recorded show because this is the first one and it's happening in the middle of StokerCon. So I hope you're all having fun and at StokerCon. But otherwise, we will be doing this live so that we can answer questions in the chat. So welcome, everybody. I want everybody to just kind of talk about where you started with poetry and where you are now with it. And this is going to be a roundtable conversation, not necessarily like a raise your hand kind of panel. This is from all of us. So who wants to start?
Jamal. I was going to volunteer back. I choose you. No.
You opened your mouth.
So for me, I mean, my stint of poetry started maybe only honestly, seriously about 7 years ago. I would say I had met Rob Cameron, who introduced me to one of my people that I had read as a young person, which is Linda Addison. And Linda Addison kind of I was being her more as a writer, as a narrative writer, prose writer. But she really I really loved her work after I started reading it. And then I read Alessandro Manzetti as well. Then they had a book called A Place of Broken Things that really inspired me a lot to really just get into it and start writing it, start sharing it. I had dabbled in it when I was a kid, but you know how that works. It's usually not things you want to show to others. But yeah, and I really started getting into it. It was a way for me to connect to my vulnerability, to my philosophy, to my perspectives about life. And 2020 really it gave me the space to really delve into it really, really strongly and completely. So now it's a major part of my life as an artist. And I love it. I feel like it's great for everyone.
That's awesome. All right.
I can go next. Well, I started writing poetry when I was probably around 11 or 12. God only knows how I was inspired. I did have a teacher that had us write some poems. And of course, I was an angsty teenager and I had a bad family life. So it was a way to get feelings out and actually start exploring the great beyond, the universe, death, life, and all that. So, of course, like Jamal said, most of my poetry was pretty atrocious. I still have it. And once in a while, I try and rewrite something. So I have written and sold poems that are, well, maybe older than some of the people on this panel. So I've been writing a while. I started to get serious in my 20s. I took there's some place in Vancouver. I don't know if it was a press, but they actually took and evaluated my poems for free. And I don't know, I started to get more serious. And then I did the Clarion Writers Workshop in fiction and have always been doing poetry. And then actually, like you, Jamal, during COVID, I intensified that because I had nothing else to do. I'd lost a brother and a mother and I was grieving. So I grieved through poetry. And yeah, I've just been doing it a very long time and I can't stop doing it.
For me, I'd always I'd grown up reading Edgar Allan Poe. I had my copy of Metamorphosis here. A lot of the classics, Homer. I was that weird kid in middle school who was carrying on a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey while everyone else was reading Harry Potter. So it's always kind of been with me since I was younger. It's just kind of about the music and the flow and the prose and everything like that. And for me getting into poetry, it actually, I attempted. I've probably told the story a lot, but I attempted verse poetry, and sent a poem into Spectral Realms in 2017, and S.T. Joshi actually said, "This is not very good. Try something else." And so I attempted a prose poem, and he was like, this is very good, you should try it again. And then I suppose the rest is history, from that point on.
That's awesome. It's awesome. I will say for my journey, it probably started in a schoolyard like ages ago when I first read The Highwaymen. I think it was like in third grade by Alfred Noyes. Fell in love. It was kind of this whole like awakening of, like, you could say the moon, the moon is full and the night is windy, or you can say the moon is a ghostly galleon upon the, cloudy seas. But I didn't actually write a lot of poetry other than angsty poetry, angsty, terrible teen poetry. I'm sorry to any teens out there. I'm not trying to offend you. Yours might be different. But yeah, and then it was later for the poetry showcases that I really got serious, because it was Peter Selman bought my first poem. And I'm going to say Science Fiction Poetry Association got an Elgin, and I was like, what the heck is this? Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I guess I could write some more poetry. So I encourage everybody watching to keep going with your poetry, because it starts out as angsty stuff and then it turns into something else.
I have to also say influences. When you mentioned The Highwayman, my sister, who's 6 years older, would recite The Highwayman and The Ballad of Sam McGee all the time. Like, she still can do it to this day. And that and Edgar Allan Poe were some early influences.
Oh yeah. We could have a whole thing where I'm just going, the Highwayman can writing, but we won't do that. One of the things I didn't hear from everybody is just introducing yourselves, where you are as a writer as well.
Oh, well, I'll start it off. Keep the loop going. I would say, by the way, the Iliad. I also was reading that in high school, Max. So I love that book. I think it's one of the greatest pieces of literature
Like,
ever written.
true confessions are starting to come out now, people.
Black dude, and I couldn't show my boys and nothing, like they didn't know what I was doing. I was hiding it. But I love that book. I love that. And I should read Dragonlance, which is another whole thing. But this is the geek side. Me, my name is Jamal Hodge. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a writer and producer, and now a poet, I suppose. And yeah, where I'm at as a writer is I've been writing for a long period of time, maybe like my whole life. It kind of helped me through some of the hardest times in my life. So now I just want to give that back. I've gotten a whole bunch of things published in like magazines, even Space and Time, a bunch of times, with you guys. And I got a book coming out with Crystal Lake, called The Dark Between the Twilight. It's my first one, but I have like about four other ones. Also, one with a really prominent person that everybody knows, coming out over the course of the next 2-3 years. So, yeah, I'm in the game.
All right. Colleen.
I've been writing poetry and fiction, and I have hundreds of poems published. I'm the president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association. So if there's any questions about that, I can always answer them, hopefully. And I continue to write both poetry and fiction. I had a collection of poetry, I Dreamed a World, that came out last year through Lichen Valley, and it's been nominated for an Elgin. And I have just launched through Eureka Publishing, this woman over here, wherever she is, my second collection called The Lore of Inscrutable Dreams. So it is available everywhere. And I tend to write dark stuff, not a lot of happy poems, I'm afraid.
As you see, my name is Maxwell Gold, and I've been writing for, now I can say, a little over half a decade. And published a little over 300 poems, and short stories, and most of my work is in cosmic and weird fiction, cosmic horror and weird fiction. I've had 2 books of prose poetry from Crystal Lake and Independent Legions Publishing. My debut collection, Oblivion and Flux, came out in 2021. And my third book of poetry, Bleeding Rainbows and Other Broken Spectrums, an NSFW collection of gay erotic horror poetry will be coming out this year, actually in less than 10 days from Hex Publishers. So
Awesome. All right. Well, let's get started. And there will be, if you're interested in finding any more information about the teachers or rereading their bios or anything like that, those descriptions will be in the course materials. Our first question, though, getting into poetry, because that's what we're talking about this time, is what is poetry to each of us? And I'm going to say, if anybody wants to say, and this is to all the students, that somebody has the definitive answer to that, there's too much, because this is one of many books. This is the Poet's Glossary by Edward Hirsch. And it's like a lot of people consider the thing on poetry, like all the poetry. He doesn't have all the poetry in here, but he does have Flarf, which I was really surprised by. But look at that. So nobody knows everything. So poetry is like a massive, just like the world, you can explore anything and find out where you fit in this massive book or all the other books that have been published about poetry, and find your spot. I feel like there's no wrong answers. There's preferences of what you prefer. And so to me, poetry is a way of saying truths without exposing myself. I can tell you what happened, terrible, terrible things, thoughts that I have that aren't kind maybe, but I can tell them in a poem and give those thoughts to somebody else and tell everybody the truth about me, without putting myself, opening myself up for attack or being exposed or anything, my private thoughts. So that's what poetry means to me a lot. It's a way to be honest.
I think that's true, and that it can go beyond like expressing parts of ourselves and also go into social commentary, political commentary. I've written poems that are like that. Also, just like different perspectives, exploring them, presenting them to other people, and sometimes poems bring people together. Like you start to think of things or people or emotions in ways that you never thought of before.
I guess just thinking about poetry and just thinking about my own definition and thinking about like Aristotle said poetry is art that imitates, but I always think sometimes I think about that backwards. Like you write enough poetry and you read enough poetry, and it's also storytelling, at the same time.
Yeah, it's absolutely that. And I think also because poetry tends to, even a prose poem is briefer than like a novel or long fiction. We're capturing the essence of the story, of the emotion, of the moment. Kind of, it's like we've condensed it down.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the way I see poetry is kind of like, it's kind of two ways. I kind of see it as like, it's like writing for the music of silence. Like sometimes sometimes you might say writing lyrics is like writing to music, but I think it's like writing to the music of silence. I also think that it's combining the subconscious mind with the conscious mind around the truth or an emotion, and then translating that. So I think like poetry, even more so than just regular narrative writing, it kind of teaches us what we know we don't know, or what we feel we don't know that we feel that we feel. So to me, it's always like it's more like a journey of self discovery, and also like exploration of self and what matters to you, what you believe, what you feel.
Well, it's interesting, like, and I'm pulling my like, trying to reach back into my like undergraduate years, my philosophy degree here, but it's like, in Aristotle's Poetics, like that's where we get the word catharsis. That's where we get into, kind of the idea, like it. Forgive my, I believe catharsis translates into like purging. So it's like poetry itself kind of is that exercise of cleansing and purging those those dark thoughts, that pity and fear and everything. So it's kind of like you said, Jamal, like that music to silence, that music to something that is otherwise maybe traumatic or fearful or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And we also the writers here in this panel are putting a speculative flavor to what we write. So whether it's horror, science fiction, fantasy, a blend, it also removes it from pointing fingers at any particular person or group or society to a point, but also it's like you can still, I don't know, bring across the point, the message, the story in a different way, and actually maybe give it more emotion, more intensity.
Spiritual transmutation,
Mm.
right? Or right onto the page. No, I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I like what has been brought up here. A lot of times it kind of, I'm getting the picture of, not that I want to mention any particular author, but Harry Potter. I know that sometimes we don't talk about that anymore, but Dumbledore. And remember the pensieve he had where he would take the thoughts and literally put them into this pensieve and get them out of his head. Sometimes I think that's what poetry and writing in general is like taking these dark things that are cluttering you up, or light things or whatever, and putting them someplace else that other people can share them. So
Mhm.
I have another question for you all that hopefully our students that normally would be here asking us questions would ask. And that is talking about elements of poetry, like what is important to us in poetry. Everybody has their own style and their own thoughts. Like imagery, like some people are very strong in imagery. Some people really appreciate metaphor. I'm a metaphor person. Or
Yeah,
rhyme.
me too.
I know there's a lot of like outcry against rhyming poems, and I understand that because sometimes they can be a little bit repetitive, or you lack the creativity because you're just looking for a rhyming word. But that's not always true, and I love internal rhyme. And so, what are some of the things that you guys like in poetry that you find really good?
Well, for me, it's specifically it's paradox and contradiction, like making the ordinary, find the extraordinary in the ordinary, or the ordinary in the extraordinary. That juxtaposition, kind of like how all truth is a paradox. Like everything is simple and complex based on what shade you look at it from, what angle you look at it from. I also like very much into lyric of obviously and epic, styles of poetry. I do, the narrative aspect of it. I love being as vulnerable as you can. Not trying to necessarily be good, or showing the darkness in you in contrast to the light as well. But just a lot of overlapping forces that normally we would see as opposites. The yin and yang. That's what I really like about in my poetry. Very story oriented, very vulnerability oriented. Sometimes very ugly. It can even cruel, but also can be in that cruelty. There's always hope of something else. So that's how I see it. That's what I love about my poetry. Yeah.
I like to, well, I use a lot of symbolism and therefore metaphor as well in my poems.
Mhm.
Um, I I sometimes I have a rhythm, but I don't always, very rarely rhyme. Though, like you said, Angela, like internal rhyme, internal alliteration, assonance. Those are all things where you're kind of playing words that kind of bleed into each other,
Mhm.
and then twisting the line. So I use enjambment a lot, where you end one line and it could go either way, and then the next line gives you more and leads you in a different direction.
Um, I guess for me, um, I like to not use the same word um, twice, unless because so for writing prose poetry, it's obviously a poem written with prose. I know how silly that sounds. Uh, but not repeating a word unless unless I have to. So I like to, I like to have some sort of purposiveness with word placement. Um, I like using portmanteaus a lot. I like, just kind of making up words or conjoining words together. And I also kind of do what Colleen said. I'm not going to try and pronounce that word, but just at least in terms of what.
Enjambment.
Yes, thank you. Enjambment. At least in terms of like, you one sentence leads into another, and a little, some, in rhythm, especially in free verse and prose poetry, and like the rhythm and the flow of the words is important to the structure. I mean, I know it doesn't always look like there's a structure, but there is some sort of flow there. So I mean, those are some of the things that I try to look for, or that are important to me in a poem.
Also, just like besides enjambment, and I know it's different often with a prose poem, but some of the poems, it's the placement of the line on the page. Is it indented? Is it, does the word actually have a visual presentation? So some poems can be read, and one of my poems that's up for a Riesling can't really be read out loud because it's got 4 languages in it. It's got binary, it's got Morse code. So in that case, it's very much a visual poem. So those are things to consider too. Do you want your poem to have a visual placement on the page that adds impact within the story of it?
Yeah, that brings up, yeah, and I try to do that too. Like, I guess, concrete poems. Like I had a poem that came out in Cosmic Horror Monthly, and it was like there was indentation where it would go like left justified, then right justified, then centered. So to kind of create that, as Colleen said, that kind of visual look. So yeah, that's something if you want to consider. I would also argue that too, that I don't think that poem is meant to necessarily be read out loud, because it's more of a visual effect.
Yeah, these are good points too. The reading poems out loud and the not reading, because sometimes we use wordplay too. Like I used mourning as in mourning, you're crying, and mourning the morning. And I know that Linda Addison did that. And then Jamal did a movie about that. So, talking about like all the different ways you can use poetry. But that's a good point to bring up, that, what are you writing the poetry for? The page visually or the performance? And some of the performance poetry I hear doesn't have to have like the story or really it's the sound. It's like listening to music, almost like where you have the sound that's just syllables, like music that's just syllables and stuff.
And that's one of the things that Linda has always emphasized to me and taught me and stressed, is the shape of your poem and the shape of your verses, and just your stanzas, like what's the shape of them and how important that is, the visual representation of your poem, and how that affects rhythm and all that good stuff. So yeah, I agree with everything everybody
Exactly. Jamal, that reminds me of one of the poems you read at StokerCon last year, I think. Just like how you read it too, like how rhythmic it is, and how poems started as like songs, that started as storytelling being passed down through generations. And the best way to memorize, like the epics and the Eddas, they were very rhythmic. They repeated. So sometimes you do want to repeat a word. I just actually sold a poem to Eternal Haunted Summer, which is on the Calabella, and the Calabella, it was very much that bardic tradition. So depending if you're reading out loud, it can be very important to have that assonance and rhythm, even if it's not rhyming.
Yeah, rhythm is important, but there's a big difference between that and rhyming. And a lot of times, a lot of rhymey poems, sometimes you got to be careful about just trying to like put a word in there just because it rhymes. Just because it's really important. Like, I think rhyming poems are very difficult to do right. Like, because a lot of times people fall into that trap of just feeling like everything needs to rhyme, where sometimes the music is just in the structure of the poem itself. It doesn't have to be every single word. It could be in the entirety of its structure, or even in its stanzas and how they connect to each other.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've all seen the poems, which are like, "There is blood upon the wall. Now I think I just might fall." And we're like, "Oh yeah, that's what I wrote." Teenage poetry. That's that angsty teenage poetry we're talking about. Um, and every time, I'm just going to say for Colleen, every time you say assonance, I want to reply with, what'd you call me? But I won't, because we're professionals. I'll just talk about that. I was going to say that. But this is a nice segue into the next topic, which is what are some of the different types of poetry? Now, there's a lot of them. So, don't worry about like grabbing out your paper, because we're not going to get to the end of that in this amount of time. But that's why this is a 12-week course. And we're still probably not going to get into all, I'm going to say we are not going to get into all the types of poetry.
We never will.
But I want to, so like types of poetry that we love. I love haiku a lot. Right now I'm doing hallucinism and haiku, which is Mario de Andrade here in Brazil. He's a national treasure. Started hallucinism in his book, which is Hallucinated City in English. And he started hallucinism in that book. And then he closed the book saying, now I close the school of hallucinism. There will be no more. So of course I'm writing the next one, because you can't tell me that, Mario. But so these are like some forms that I love. I love haiku, and I do stick with the 575 syllabic structure because I enjoy that structure. It's like a puzzle. But then my poetry developed from linked haiku, which I think are also called gunsaku or rinsaku, or, I've seen that both ways, to adding hallucinism into it. So I do have that broken out kind of thing. So what are some of the poetry forms you guys like to work with?
Well, go ahead, Max.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, obviously I enjoy prose poetry. I mean, there is, so the standard definition of prose poetry is poetry written with prose. I mean, now you can, usually it's like one or two stanzas, usually, like, or, a paragraph, I suppose. But that's not a general rule. Like you can write a prose poem and you can structure it as if you're writing a free verse poem. As long as it is written with prose. I've done that a few times. I've done like centered poems with prose. I've even sprinkled some concrete poetry in there, but as long as you're still writing it as prose, then it will still qualify as a prose poem. I mean, I've dabbled in epic poetry. That kind of gets into a whole different, like epic poem versus like a verse novel, like a poetic novel. That, and sometimes free verse. But those are kind of the areas I've played around with in concrete poetry.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, you want to go, Colin?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I guess I'm similar to you, Max, in that I like prose poetry as well. From the definition of it, I do that, but not in the way that you do it. I'm more like a free verse person. I'm more like into just doing like poetry that doesn't follow like a particular rhyme or meter, you know what I mean? Just kind of flowing and doing that. I like ballad because I like rhyme, rhythm. I do like epic because I know it's pretty much like a prose poem, but following a hero, basically, like a character. You know what I mean? Like a clearly defined character throughout, almost like a story, like the Iliad, like we were saying. And then just kind of like sometimes like lyrical stuff where you just kind of more like it's just expressing your emotions and thoughts, like, so those are my spaces that I like.
One thing I will say, without getting into like a whole conversation about prose poetry, is like the biggest thing with like prose poetry and free verse is like usually punctuation. Like when you start getting into like punctuation, comma placement, semicolons, or hyphens, depending on like that's kind of the border between whether it turns into a prose poem or like a free verse poem. Because I mean, you can still have, I'm not saying you can't have punctuation in a free verse poem, but like visually it then
it's different. It's not like just a complete paragraph like a prose poem would be.
Well, I've also written prose poetry, and I sometimes don't use punctuations in a way that it becomes a little more stream of thought. I tend to be a person that uses very little punctuation in my free verse poetry, because really, like, if you're using your line breaks correctly, you don't need a comma at the end. Now, sometimes you do, depending on the form. But yeah, in prose poems, sometimes I've used punctuation, sometimes I haven't. And again, it's all how you want to emphasize it. And I had an argument once with a publisher over a poem that was a reprint over a comma, over one comma, because I wanted a breathless sound going through the line. And she was like, "This is grammatically incorrect." And so we did have quite an argument over that. I almost pulled my poem because of it.
That
So
wasn't me, by the way.
it was not you. No, and it wasn't Linda. Nobody here. I don't even remember who it was. Lucky. But yeah, so I mean, I'd love to say I've done everything, but since there's like thousands of forms out there, nobody's done everything. I've done haiku, which is also sci-fi ku, horror ku, heina ku, which is a shorter form of haiku, even shorter than a haiku. I've done senaru, tanka, haibun. Haibun is where you mix prose and a haiku. So it's it's a little bit of both. You have a prose paragraph that could be very lyrical or just a um, straight prose paragraph, and then you have usually it ends with a haiku. And I've done a sijo, which is a Korean form. It's very complex in getting the syllables and the stresses right. I've only done one. I'm hoping to do some more, but I think it's 7 lines, but then you have to cluster the words in each line by like groups of 4 and then 3 and 3 and then 4. And so it takes a little bit of math to work it out. Longer forms, I've done sestina. Again, like a sestina is 6 verses of 6 lines and then 3 lines at the end, but you have 6 words that each line must end in and in different orders. So again, it's a bit of math. And then your last 3 lines have 2 of the words in each of the 3 lines. And it's just like, it's fun to do, is because it's kind of like a bit of a puzzle. And it's like, can I make these words come together and have them make sense? So yeah, two sestinas so far. I do a lot of free verse. It's I guess my fallback form. I actually kind of like loosely made up forms sometimes in a poem where there might be a particular repetition of A, B, C, F, whatever lines that, it gives it a particular structure that I haven't found out there. But yeah, I like to explore them all. I find forms, it's a different form of discipline in writing a poem. And it was something I explored a lot more during COVID because I had more time. I was grieving, so it took my mind off of my grief because I had to work on these almost mathematical structures. But yeah, there's so many different forms out there.
Awesome. I have another question, and this is a surprise to you guys because I didn't put it in that nice organized list, but I just thought of it. I was like, I have to ask this. I was just on another panel where we were talking about how we take our poetry and use it in our other work. And so as I'm looking at us, all of us write fiction, nonfiction. We're all, Jamal does film. So we all have creative endeavors, not poetry as well. How do you put your poetry in your other creative works, or do you? Like sometimes I'll write a prose, like a short story, and then I'll also do a poem about it if I love that idea. Or sometimes a poem will turn into a short story, or even a book, or I have poetry in a book, How are some of the ways that you guys do that as well? Put your poetry in your other creative work.
Well, go ahead, Max.
So yeah, I mean, actually, now I'm thinking about it, I actually do that not frequently because I don't write short stories all that much. But I mean, when I do write short stories, I've actually because it's actually, so in the weird fiction genre, it's actually fairly common. You see poetry integrated a lot in fiction. So like sometimes I'll do like a poem or like a verse like at the beginning as if to mimic some sort of like ancient text or some sort of like like long forgotten something or other. And I actually have a novella coming out next year it's called I Am Someday, and someday is death, and it's involved with the Holocaust. And so I've actually used poetry to kind of assume what this otherworldly creature would, or deity would speak, because we tend to kind of assume poetry is the music of the gods, or the music of something beyond us. So short answer is yes. I do tend to use poetry in my fiction.
Yeah. So like the music of silence, right? Of consciousness, in a sense. Um, well, for me, I mean, obviously, I work in many different art forms. Not film, TV, novel, poem, but I think that poetry, um, it has its place in everything. Like it fits in every form and in every genre. So I really write something that's not even based on a poem or have some form of poetry in it, because I feel like it's a way of it's a deeper way of conveying information in a short amount of time, or an emotion. So I use it in my books. I use it in my scripts. Usually my scripts will have some sort of poetry in it, on my screenplays. With or I use it as inspiration, like I did with Morning Meal, based off of Linda Allison's thing, like you mentioned, Angela. And that was basically more like taking the essence and the pain of a poem and translating it into an entire narrative story, and then having that acted out. So we actually are working right now on an entire series based around that concept and that theme. So you know, fingers crossed that it gets picked up, but it's in motion.
Yeah, I have some poems or poetic aspects that I have put into stories. Sometimes there might be a character who says something. I've also there's been a few cases where I've taken a story and written a poem from it, or vice versa.
Hmm.
Um, I wouldn't say I do it all the time, but definitely, like, I think about if I can use poetics in some way, and often there might be passages. Like I wrote one story that was completely a lyrical story. So in a way, I guess you could say it was a prose poem, but it was like 10 pages or whatever, just because that lyricism and that rhythmic way of speaking or reading went all the way through the story. That's rare. Takes a lot of work. Max
Mhm.
is probably more an expert at that, but um, yeah, it's something that's always there. Like, it's not completely separate, and there's it's in the background. Can I use this? Can I bring in a poetic aspect?
Yeah, and I've done that before with like just long like pieces of a story that I've never that I won't use, and actually turn one of it into a verse novel that's coming out in 2025 in 2025. Um, sometimes you just like in especially if you're interested in prose poetry, like you can take a chunk of something, and if you can kind of like reverse engineer it, or just kind of keep going, you can have like a either an epic poem, or you can have
Hmm.
you can have a verse novel, or you can have, and we can talk about verse novels at some point, but like verse novels don't always have to, they don't have to rhyme. That's it's just another word for a poetic novel. Um but yeah, it's that's a great way to kind of reverse engineer different types of poetry.
Yeah, I actually just remembered, I think that I did that from Max's book, Omni Park 1. He had a story called, and he's going to have to fill this in, The Fisherman's Call, right?
Oh, the Fisherman's Last Call.
Last Call. And then I got in Omni Park 2, which is coming out, so I can announce that. I mean, I can talk about that without anybody getting mad at me. So I did the prequel, because that one is the first, but I took your verse, didn't I, that you had in the original one, and didn't I reuse that? I'm trying to think back to that story now.
The little like the something at the unparalleled something at the bottom of the sea, unparalleled eons or something.
Oh yeah. And then
Mhm.
that was hilarious because the editor actually commented to me like, "Oh, that's a really brilliant line," or something. I was like, "Well, I didn't write that one. That's from Max's. That's Maxwell I Gold did that one." So yeah, we do. But I was using that as the thread throughout my story to connect it to the Maxwell story, so that they were prequel and then the end. But that's another thing, like poetry being the thread that keeps everything together, like we've said, like in a prose piece. So.
And that's also another form of poetry, ekphrastic poetry, where you are inspired to write a poem based on a piece of art. Could be a song, could be a dancer, could be another poem, could be a painting. And I've done that a lot, like where I'm inspired by other works and then I write something that's ekphrastic, which is a hard word to say, much harder than enjambment.
Stop giving me all these words.
I know, right?
Yeah, that's the Ladies of Horror, which is run by Nina D'Arcangelo, is a group of women that do that every month. We write off of a photo that she sends us. And I will say, ekphrastic poetry, which I'm sure we will cover here very soon in the next 12 weeks, is a really awesome way to kind of break like writer's block. Or if you feel like you can't really get going, you just start writing something about somebody else's stuff. And lo and behold, you have a whole new thing. And I think I've sold every single thing that I've done, which are ekphrastics, from her challenge. So those are always good. So, all right. Well, the final topic will be, what advice, I mean, for this week, we will be back. What advice do you guys have for the students for this class? Like, what do you, if you could say one thing to them, of course, we're going to say many things. Don't turn on me now. But what would you tell them? Like, I think I would say, listen to other people, but listen to yourself first. You know, stay true to what you want. If somebody's telling you that's not working for you, the point of this is communicating with somebody else. Otherwise, you'd be singing in the shower. So we want that communication. We have to have people give us the feedback and have them receive this. But also, if somebody says something like, this isn't working, well, maybe they're not getting your vision. Keep refining that vision, but that doesn't mean give up on what your vision is. What do you guys have to offer?
I think I'd say don't overthink when you're doing the initial poem. Like, just write it down. I do this a lot. I write in blank books, and it may be really crappy. But then once you've got your idea out, then you start going through and you start honing it. You start looking for those unique visions, because you don't want to be saying what everyone else said. You don't want to be saying the same thing. It's another poem about a vampire all alone at night. So you need to make it unique, and that's what you do, is then you start going through the editing process and the refining.
Yeah, or like, you know, or going on Colleen's point, like you know, like, what can I do to make a poem about Dracula different than everyone else? Like, you know, what can I do to make a poem about you know, gargoyles? Like, I had a poem in the Gargoylecon. I don't remember what it was about. It was something. It was basically like a cosmic horror twist on gargoyles. And Colleen, I think you were in that too. I think. But it was like a
yes,
but,
yes, I'm in there as well.
But it was just like you know, just you know what's already been done, and how can you make it, you know, make it different. So the other piece of that is read, you know, like read other people, you know, and always go back to the classics. I would say, like, at least in poetry, like I have my copy of Metamorphosis by Ovid. Like, there's nothing wrong with going back and reading like Ovid or Homer or Dante. Like, don't only read those, but like you know, always read, everything.
Yeah. Well, just add to what everybody else has said already. I would say let the heart lead and the head follow. I think it's your first drive. Just let it flow out of you, and then apply the mind for the edit later. Then try to be clever later. I think that's really important. I also think that you got to be kind of like be brave. That sounds weird with writing, but you know, writing can be very intimidating, very scary. We all, you know, it's kind of like it's kind of like a little fight, you know what I mean? A little war sometimes with yourself, to really get the truth out. So have the courage to be vulnerable enough to tell your truth on the page, to get it out of you and put it down on the page. Like Max said, I would say read everything. And like Colleen basically was saying, don't judge. Don't judge the first draft, as it might never be what you want it to be. But over time and refinement, it will inspire you to really get to where you want it to be. So that's what I would say. Be kind to yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jamal. And also, like, you're probably never going to be satisfied with it.
Mm-hmm.
The poems that I read that I was like, I don't know, I published it and then it's like, oh, that was amazing. That's the best thing ever written. This is obviously genius. I'll read it a week later and I go, oh my God, what is wrong with that? What was I even thinking? Look at look at the assonance.
Yep.
Oh, the enjambment.
Oh, that sounds like a whole poem right there. And now, like, because you guys brought up like vampire poems and doing it differently and Dracula and everything, I'm going to write a poem called Dracula Smacula. That is so different. Nobody's ever done that.
I have a crazy story that I'm writing in my book. I'm not a good person. I'm a New Yorker.
Is that the title?
It's a title, yeah.
I thought this was like an admission. You heard it right here first, people.
But there's a vampire story. It's called Vampire versus Crackhead. That's a free verse kind of like epic poem.
Oh, so, that's awesome. I gotta read that.
Combining the urban with the, trying to do something different. Like everybody's saying, like doing just merging the unorthodox with the orthodox, to make something.
Yeah, I agree. Who said there's nothing new under the sun? That's like a famous, people throw that quote around. And I'll say that's true. But if everything exists, we constantly recombine it into new flavors and intentions and meanings. And so that doesn't mean don't keep hashing away and get your axe out and chop it up and reassemble it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, we tell often the same stories, but from different ways, and you can make it new. So yes, you can have a vampire story that's still new.
Because your perspective is always going to be unique and your perspective is valuable. Everybody has done everything already, but you haven't. And the way you see things is it's gonna resonate with certain people in a different way. So your perspective has value always.
That's why it's important to read too, so that you don't just tell the same story.
Yes.
So I'll say, I'm going to amend that with there's nothing new under the sun, but they haven't read your stuff yet. And this is to our students. So, all right, I guess it's about time to close off. This class has been awesome. I can't wait to do the 12 weeks all together with you guys. And we're going to have so many cool things coming out. I'm going to end with like a little point about poetry that anybody who knows it is like, oh God, she's going into poetry and magic again. But I was reading a text about shamanism. That's what I'm doing now, is studying a lot of shamanism and stuff for something I'm putting together. And it was talking about poetry, haiku 575 type poetry was the initial, like way, way back in the day, began as the utterances of shaman conjuring magic. And then I thought of all of the things, bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, and all the times that we have poetry that's an incantation. And so I've just kind of like seized upon that as poetry literally is magic. So when you're writing poetry, you are creating something amazing. So I know a lot of times poetry gets discounted, like, oh, poets, and sometimes that's even me saying that. Usually when I'm publishing Space and Time, but it truly is magic. So I'm proud of everybody here for taking this class, for getting this magic and learning to be a better poetry shaman, or however you want to say it. And that's me pausing so you guys can add any comments you want, and then I'll just read through the syllabus and then everybody will know what to expect.
Just remember to have fun. You're here to have fun. You're here to discover things about yourself. And just remember to have fun while you go through this process, and happy to go on this journey with you.
And don't forget, or don't be afraid to ask us questions. We don't know everything, but we'll try to help guide.
Yeah. Everyone's kind of, yeah. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Awesome. Well, what can you expect coming up in this next 12 weeks? This syllabus is in the materials that you can download with this class. Also, some text links and links to our different books will be in there. This obviously is Introduction to Poetry Writing. That's what we've been talking about for the past hour. Next week will be Finding Inspiration, which is how do you find inspiration for poetry and creativity, how to read and analyze poetry as well, which gives you another tool. Then it's Exploring Language and Imagery. Week 4 is Crafting Poetic Forms. Week 5, we'll be getting into the alliteration, the assonance and rhyme, the musicality of language and playing with sound. Week 6, Working with Metaphor and Simile. That's going to be one of my favorite weeks to talk. Week 7 is Understanding Tone and Voice. Week 8, we'll be talking about writing from your personal experience, which a lot of times is also making a difference in the world, your personal experience. And then you can talk about things that are bothering you, like maybe book banning or, not preloading a thing that you could talk about, but things that are affecting you in the real world and bringing them out in your poetry. Week 9 will be experimenting with structure and layout. And we might even do some sonnets or something there. Week 10 will be collaborative writing, which is a whole nother special challenge that I think that it often doesn't get talked about enough. Maxwell and I wrote a poetry book together, and there's I know Colina's done collaborative poetry, Jamal's done collaborative things, but there's a lot of things that go into that because now you have two creative visions merging or colliding, and there's different ways to work with that. Week 11 will be probably the most boring, but the most important, which is editing and revision. So yawn, but also super important. And then we will finish this with sharing and publishing, talking about the different ways that you can get your poetry out there for everybody to read. But also, I believe that Crystal Lake Publishing will be gathering these poems into an anthology. I heard that right? Like, I don't want to be putting words into Joe's mouth and getting in trouble, but I believe an anthology is coming from this class. So everything that you write in here is, I'm not going to say everything because I will get in trouble, but poems that you write in here will be published with Crystal Lake.
The world's going to see
it. So do good. Don't shame us. So on that note, that's it. Look in the materials for all the links, the bios, the syllabus, and we will see you next week. And next week we'll be live and we'll be answering questions. All right. Bye, guys.